As you may know, my Miata motor gave out this past August, and it was time for me to pull it out of the car. The Miata engine was relatively easy to pull, but the first thing I wanted to do was get the hood off to give myself as much room as possible to work with. All it takes to get it off are the 4 bolts that hold it onto the hood, the 2 bolts for the struts, and taking off the hose for the windshield wiper fluid. Next, disconnect the negative terminal of the battery, put a cloth underneath so it doesn't hit the battery connection again, and then move on to draining the fluids. You're going to need to drain the coolant. Draining the oil is a good idea as well, and then you'll also need to drain the gearbox oil because you're going to be pulling out the driveline in order to get the engine out. Also be careful and make sure not to spill, because spilling is something that immature car enthusiasts do, and if you spill, it's really just showing that you have no idea what you're doing at all. So don't spill, makes a huge mess anyway. Up next, we took off the air intake. It's mostly 10mm bolts and clamps to hold on the hoses. There is also a plug for the mass airflow sensor, and with that there's a metal wire that connects around it, and all you need to do is pop that little metal clip around the outside of the plug and the plug will pull right off. Don't just try to pull this plug, otherwise you could end up breaking it pretty easily. After the air intake, I pulled the radiator. For this, there's only 2 bolts at the bottom, and from there you just wrangle it out, and then you're good to go. After disconnecting the radiator, I went ahead and took off the other coolant lines and the heater hoses in the back. There's one coolant line on the bottom that connects to the radiator, and there's a bolt that you could undo to get the whole system off, and then the 2 heater core hoses on the back, just pull those out. They do take a bit of finagling because they've been sitting there for so long, but that's all you need to get the coolant system done. Next up, I took off the 2 fuel lines. There's a fuel in and a fuel return line right next to the air intake. Have a bucket underneath just in case any other fuel spills out, because sometimes it does and sometimes it's all drained back. So just have one just in case, because you don't want that out and about, especially if it's a sunny day and things can spontaneously combust pretty quickly. So just be cautious with this. From there, I dismantled the shifter. There's 4 bolts on top and then 3 bolts hidden underneath that you need to take out to get the whole system out. Just set it somewhere clean, by the way, so that way you don't have any debris getting back into the shifter once you reinstall it. So that's all you need to get that out. As for the exhaust, I was going to try and undo the 3 bolts from the headers to the downpipe, but I had issue getting them, so I went ahead and just disconnected the downpipe by the catalytic converter and then taking off the headers individually. Even with that, they wouldn't quite finagle their way out, but once you start lifting the engine out a little bit, then it creates enough space to get them out. So not quite the ideal situation, but it does work. There was a lot that I skipped, but all it was pulling small wires and hoses, stuff that I really couldn't get a good view on for the camera, and other things that would just take a long time of watching me wiggle my hand for a few minutes doing. Not much for you guys, so I went ahead and skipped all of it, but that's all that was left. All the major parts were done, except for taking out the transmission. After that, it was just the process of lifting the engine out. Do it slowly, do it carefully. You see me go up and down a few times just trying to make sure everything is clear. Double check it 5-6 different times before you start pulling, making sure everything is disconnected. One thing that I did run into was the shifter has a little bit of a lip coming up at the end of the transmission, so you have to make sure to balance the engine so that way it dips down as you start to lift it out of the mounts, just that way it clears quite easily. Other than that, it's just that simple to get a Miata engine out. Once I got the engine out, I got to see just how bad it really was. The whole engine was caked in oil, as well as the transmission as well. Now you may be looking at the top and the very bottom and saying, hey, that really doesn't look too bad. I could see the silver where it's pretty clean, but I did pressure wash the top and I was able to use an undercarriage sprayer on the bottom to clean off some of the oil residue. But anywhere on the side, you can see it's just caked in oil. There were leaks all over the place, as well as in piston number 2, you can see it's wet compared to the other pistons, and that's because that piston ring had gone. And that was the issue that ultimately led to the engine becoming a 3-cylinder, was the fact that so much oil was getting leaked through that the spark couldn't even generate a spark because there was too much oil coating it. And even when I put in a brand new spark plug, it wouldn't last more than 20 seconds before it got gunked up. There was also coolant leaks and other miscellaneous issues along the way, so it was just time for this 200,000 mile Miata engine to get replaced.